All across Missouri, our new car and truck dealers are building strong local economies. When you buy a car or truck in Missouri, you're helping to support over 20,000 Missouri families who rely on the auto industry for good-paying local jobs. You're also helping fund our communities, schools, first responders, and our roads because dealers generate millions of dollars in tax revenue. Missouri's automobile dealers have been the foundation of our communities for generations and for generations to come. The Missouri Automobile Dealers Association, the heart of Missouri.
Welcome to a special Mother's Day edition of This Week in Missouri Politics. As the legislative session winds down, we are very excited to be joined this week by a returning member to This Week in Missouri Politics, Speaker John Deal. Mr. Speaker, welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me back again.
We're very glad to have you. The legislative session's winding down. You have already got a lot of your work completed in the House of Representatives. Let's talk about some of the things you've done and start with the budget.
Sure.
The budget this year was done earlier. That matters to Missourians, and it also matters to Missourians because there's more money for education. Tell us why it actually is important you got it done early.
Well, number one, the budget's is our constitutional obligation to get done during the session. So if there's one thing we have to get done, it's the budget. We thought that it would be important to try to get the budget done a few weeks earlier than normal. So we have the opportunity to override or deal with any objections that the governor has to our budget and be able to deal with those while we're still in session before we leave at the end of this week. So in our budget, our priority is to do record funding for education at all levels, which we did do. We got the budget to the governor about 2 weeks earlier. So we're going to probably start this coming week looking at any objections that he has and deciding whether or not we can override him. And why is that important? It's important for the principal reason of a lot of the institutions such as schools, providers who provide care for the elderly and for those in nursing homes and for those with special needs and our universities, a lot of their fiscal years begin on July 1st, just as ours do. So by having the old system on how we used to do it, they would go into their new fiscal year uncertain as to how much money they actually have to budget on for that year because we couldn't deal with vetoes or objections to the governor until September. So our goal is to deal with those early, so those institutions have certainty on that sort of stuff.
Talking about the budget, you're the father of the state's first tax cut in decades. Is the state of Missouri on track to provide tax relief next year?
I believe they are. So the tax cut has triggers with revenue as long as revenues increase year over year by a certain amount. That a phase of the tax cut will be implemented, and so revenues have been very robust over the past year. We projected them to be around 4.6% for this year. They're going to be about 7%, slightly over 7%, and we foresee that trend increasing into the next fiscal year. So if that happens, the tax cuts will kick in, which will be good for Missouri businesses. It'll be particularly good for Missouri small businesses, that they can be comfortable that Missouri finally is moving toward a system which is stable for business, which provides a good business environment, allows them to grow and prosper.
You know, I'm just a simple hillbilly from Butler County, but I have a feeling nobody got off work Friday, looked at their pay stub and goes, my gosh, I didn't give enough money to the government. Is there any chance that during your term as Speaker, you're going to be able to cut taxes even more?
Well, I think that's something we're going to look at again next year. I mean, our goal and job is not to just increase the size of government if revenues increase. So if revenues continue on their positive trajectory up, okay, we're going to be looking to give some of that money back to the taxpayers rather than just spend it on more wasteful government programs. The budget we just passed is a very lean budget. It's based upon conservative revenue estimates, and we also under-appropriated in that budget. And as part of all that, we not only provided record funding for education, but we also addressed some of the long-term deferred maintenance need the state has been kicking the can down the road for almost a decade. So we are addressing deferred maintenance on buildings and universities. Those types of issues don't go away. They just keep getting worse and worse and worse. And we haven't been addressing that, so those are also addressed in this budget. And I think long-term, that's going to free up more money for maybe potential tax cuts down the line.
Speaking of cutting government, you may have cut government by more than anyone since the Hancock Amendment with municipal court reform. Tell us how you got that done, and tell us the actual details of the bill. How have you protected citizens from government with this piece of legislation?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's many layers of government, right? There's federal government, there's state, and there's local. And in too many areas of the state, residents were being preyed upon by predatory practices by some municipal governments. And there's no doubt, particularly in this county, that there are many municipalities, I believe there's 92, and many of those survive solely on the basis of fining their own citizens.
All over the state, though.
All over the state,
yeah.
but the issue's particularly bad here. And I agree that there's issues across the state too. We have municipalities in this county that have a couple hundred people live in them.
Sure.
Yet there's over 10,000 outstanding traffic warrants in that county. And so what that does, I think it does a couple things. One, it justifies the existence of a city, that probably can't adequately provide services to its citizens, and they fund it by fining people that just happen to pass through it, which really isn't the way a government ought to operate. And also, too, it doesn't really address the minimal standards that a city should have in order to operate. And that also is in this bill. We set forth minimal performance criteria for cities that say you need to have a balanced budget, you need to have cash flow accounting systems, you need to have certifications for your police, written use of force policies, and certain financial
Seem like some common sense things to have a city.
Right.
I think we all want to see Ozzie Smith protected. I know I definitely do in St. Louis. What about John Smith? Currently in the bill, rural Missourians are left much more at the mercy of government than St. Louis County. There's 12% in St. Louis County. Outside of St. Louis County, you get 20% of some kangaroo
Right.
city could harass people. Next year, would you look at protecting John Smith as much as you do Ozzie Smith?
So what we did on that is that percentage got reduced from 30%
Isn't it rural
down to
Republicans
20%.
love with bureaucrats that was it their legislators that wanted their citizens harassed more?
Well, so
Senators and reps.
I wouldn't classify it as Republican or Democrat. I would just classify it
there's
as,
no more
as the
Democrat
focus
rural
on that.
legislators.
Yeah, I would just focus it on that, and we're always willing to take a look at that.
Excellent. So let's talk about another issue of reform. You finished education reform this week.
Correct.
Can you tell us, is there anything different from last year's bill the governor vetoed? And the governor said he was going to communicate with the legislature. Do you know if he's going to sign it?
I don't know if he's going to sign this bill. He said he's going to give it a careful review. I believe he probably will, but I don't have any particular information on that. He's not personally told me that. Last year, he vetoed the bill on the basis that there was a private option for students that are in troubled school districts. So in the interest of getting something done, we took the private option out this year. But what we did do is replaced it with greatly enhanced charter and virtual school choices for those students. I mean, look, we have far too many children in this state that are in underperforming school districts. That's not acceptable. While I'm a private option fan, I'm okay with that. We also can't just keep kicking the can down the road on this issue and have generations of students having no choices because people can't get 100% of what they want. So what this bill will do is if you're in an underperforming school district, those students and those parents of those students will have options to get their children into a performing building or into a charter option or to allow for virtual schooling. So I think that's very important. I think it's going to be a giant step forward, And I sincerely hope that the governor signs this bill so we don't lose another generation of children.
One of the most repeated quotes of all session was yours at the very first day when you said you're not going to have a Ferguson agenda.
Correct.
You're going to have an agenda that helps all Missourians.
Correct.
Do you think these two pieces of legislation are examples of things that are good for Farmington and Ferguson and the entire state?
Right, and if you go back to what I said at the beginning of session, this isn't about one city or one incident that happened. I also said we're not going to turn around and make law enforcement scapegoats for societal problems. And I think we've honored that pledge. We've kept it, and everything that we've done has addressed structural issues with how citizens interact with their government. We've dealt with abuse of municipal court practices. We've dealt with poor practices by municipalities, and we've dealt with the inability of school districts to provide children they're supposed to serve a meaningful education, and we've given those children and those families real choices to get out of a bad system if need be.
Last question. You're the first speaker to ever pass right to work out of the House.
Correct.
It's in the Senate. It seems like we're set up for a week full of drama surrounding that in the Senate. If the Senate passes it, the governor is almost certain to veto it. Can you override a right to work veto in the House?
Well, I think, number one, I think you're right. It's if the Senate passes it next week, and if the governor, I'm sure the governor will veto the bill. I've said from day one on this that I think a veto in September is going to be extraordinarily difficult to accomplish. Never before in the history of the country has right to work been enacted over a governor's veto. What it does do, though, is set a clear stage of what it means to have a Republican governor versus a Democratic governor. And I like to take these things one step at a time. Is that with a House did its job, we passed it. Let's see what the Senate does. Let's see what the governor does. I think there's probably also some lessons to be learned from the tax cut battles from a couple of years ago, that getting it done during September veto session after there have been months of campaigns and misinformation put out there is going to be much more difficult to do than if we were in session and able to control. And that's why we sent that to the Senate.
Well, sounds like you give us a very good reason to have you back on This Week in Missouri Politics prior to veto session.
Hey, I'll look forward to it.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And we'll be right back to hear the reactions to this interview with our opinion maker panel after this.
All across Missouri, our new car and truck dealers are building strong local economies. When you buy a car or truck in Missouri, you're helping to support over 20,000 Missouri families who rely on the auto industry for good-paying local jobs. You're also helping fund our communities, schools, first responders, and our roads, because dealers generate millions of dollars in tax revenue. Missouri's automobile dealers have been the foundation of our communities for generations, and for generations to come. The Missouri Automobile Dealers Association, the heart of Missouri.
Welcome back to This Week in Missouri Politics. We're now joined by our opinion maker panel, starting with the first time on the program for Jeff Roorda, St. Louis Police Association business manager, former state representative, CNN, worldwide media extraordinaire, up-and-coming star on the Republican Party, Representative Kevin Corlew from over in the western part of the state. First time on, welcome.
Thank you.
Patrick Lynn, veteran of This Week in Missouri Politics, Director of Advocacy, greatest hair at the Kelly Group, and I'm sure a lot of other things happened. Part-time Jeff Sidian now, maybe more next week?
Yeah, maybe more next week.
See you next week.
Yeah.
And returning guest, Caleb Rowden, representative from the Columbia area, and be taking on some leadership roles maybe in the future. So let's ask now, what did you think of your speaker? What did you think of his interview?
Well, I think he's dead on a lot of things. I mean, I think his leadership has been very important for us to be intentional about passing big ticket legislation. And a lot of things he mentioned, SB 5, municipal courts, school transfer, a solution to med-mal caps that has eluded us for a number of years that the governor signed this week. Those are big, hairy policy things that we took on, passed them, they're going to become law. good leadership from him, a united Republican caucus, and it's made for a good year.
Jeff Roorda, you've served in the House. It seems to be a much more orderly fashion of the way things are approached this year. Maybe not even good for Democrats because it's just been an orderly, seems like every week something comes out of the House.
Right, and John and I had a really good relationship when I was in the legislature, but I warned all my friends, I said, hey, the scariest thing about John Deal as Speaker is he's capable and he can get things done. He can keep the railroad running on time, and when our agendas don't match up, that's tough for Democrats.
Patrick Lynn, you're a legislative veteran. What have you thought about not just this interview, but how he's ran the House?
Well, I'm not quite as enamored as everyone else with the Speaker, and I would say even a stop clock is correct twice a day, and so he's had some good wins this session and been right on a few pieces of legislation.
And it almost has been probably worse if you are a Democrat because while you might have enjoyed some of the chaos, you don't the orderly part of it you don't enjoy because it actually passes legislation.
Yes, the best way to protect our freedoms and liberty is for the legislature to be inefficient and ineffective.
On that we can agree on. Representative Corlew, there's one interesting part that he brought up when we asked you about right to work. The first Speaker to ever pass it out of the House, if it does get sent to the governor and vetoed, can you guys override that? Is that something the Speaker could pull off an override on?
Well, the Speaker's done a tremendous job in leading us through some of these big ticket items. On right to work, it has historically been a tough poll to get done, and I imagine it would be pretty tough on this as well. We have a number of Republicans that are in strong labor districts. We've been able to grow our majority by being able to reach out to some of those districts. So we'll see. I think that it's, as Speaker Deal said, on that front, we've moved the needle, but as far as overcoming an override, we'll just have to see how that transpires if and when it passes the Senate.
Jeff Roorda, you're a labor leader. Does this get PQ'd? I mean, is this the type of, do you PQ a Republican, and what kind of shockwaves does that send to what some call the mini House?
Well, I mean, you'll have two houses of representatives and no Senate if that happens, and I mean, it amazes me that Republicans turn their guns not only on working families, but also on the many, many business owners that understand what a great relationship it is for them to have a labor union there and how it provides quality, well-trained workers and increases their profits. I mean,
they're also turning their guns on Republicans themselves in the Senate.
Right, and the Republicans could be in power forever. I mean, this is Democrats' best opportunity to pick up seats is all the noise about right to work, whether you pass it or not. Just a sustained effort to hurt working Missourians helps Democrats.
Patrick Lynn, the Speaker brought up something about what this does do is frame the governor's race. Does this put even more impetus for the entire state Democratic Party, maybe even outside groups, to make sure there's a Governor Koster?
I agree. I think with what we've seen in the last year with Ferguson and some other issues has probably, unfortunately for Democrats, pushed some white working class voters towards the Republican Party. I think the passage of right to work is a way to bring them right back to the Democratic Party.
You've been around long enough to remember when Democrats were in power. The Democrats never PQ'd their own members, correct?
Correct.
So this would be the first time this ever happened where a body would PQ their own members to pass a piece of legislation.
Yeah. The Democrats didn't even PQ any member of the Senate, and I don't believe, when they didn't even PQ Republicans. It was Senate privilege to stand and talk about a bill as long as you wanted.
Is the state government better for that? Will people like what they get when you have two houses?
I think it's important for the Senate to work together collegially, but also elections have consequences. And while I believe we elect Jay Nixon as a governor to set policy for the state, and the voters want him to enact and lead on the issues he campaigned on, they also elected a Republican legislature, and they want them to enact and lead on the issues they campaigned on. So there is a dichotomy there, but it's, the Republicans in the legislature should do what they said they were going to do, and then we'll see the consequences.
Killer Brown, there is one thing the Speaker mentioned when he said we're moving the needle. We're changing the dynamic of this debate to this is what we do. When the Senate Republicans, if they PQ their own members and they change the debate, you're someone whose phone rings asking you to run for Senate now in your county with the seat that's opening up from Senator Schaefer. What do you think as a person that might serve in that body about when you change that dynamic, it doesn't, you don't go back?
Yeah, and I think you just have to, different people have different motivations. I wouldn't even claim that probably Speaker Deal and House leadership and Senate leadership maybe have the same idea of why we're doing what we're doing here. And so, certainly Senator Richard, I think, probably leading the charge over there. There is certainly a new conversation that is forming around right to work in Missouri, and it's my hope that this has become such a partisan issue, largely rhetorical. I mean, I think there are some pros, I think there's some cons, there's some benefits. Let's have a policy conversation. Does it change the game in the Senate? Certainly for the rest of this year, yes, and then next year you come back probably with a different set of variables. But ultimately that's a decision that Senator Richard's gonna have to make.
There was a Corlew last thing on this. Also talked about education reform. Came through. You were not here for last year's. You hadn't been elected yet for last year's education thing. How do you feel about where the governor is? I mean, you're a freshman legislator. Have you got any feel for, there's more? We've heard there's more engagement from the governor's staff on these issues. Do you believe this becomes law, and is it a good piece of legislation?
It is a good piece of legislation. Although I was not in the legislature last year, I was on a school board in Kansas City, and I was on the North Kansas City School Board. And so we were a receiving district at the time when Kansas City Public Schools was unaccredited. So the previous transfer scheme engendered years of litigation both in Kansas City and in St. Louis. It was imperative for our students and for our schools on both sides, either sending or receiving districts, that we get something done and that we don't kick the can down the road another year. So I'm hopeful that the governor will sign it. There were aspects of it in it that necessarily may not be perfect in everybody's world as far as education, but it was something. It's a good bill taking into account a lot of interest groups and getting it done.
Next topic, Representative Roorda, former Representative Roorda, in your new position as head of the St. Louis Police Association, the court reform bill. It passed this week. Your take on what that does to let's talk about how police are viewed in the St. Louis area, and the effect that has on the police. We seem to we don't ever focus on a lot on what about the cops that have to do these jobs. Right. What is the effect of that on the police here in this area?
Well, let me take a step back first and weigh in just for a second on the school transfer bill. We're not kicking the can down the road. We're putting on a bus for an hour ride both ways, and that doesn't solve the underlying societal problems that we have that leads to the next Michael Brown or the next Vonder at Myers. Schools are failing these kids, and we're not fixing the schools. We're just spreading the problem without addressing the central problem.
What could you do to fix the schools? I think everyone should know.
Well, we could have schools that sort of fill in for the failures of parents in these urban neighborhoods, where kids go year-round in urban school districts, where they're there for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and they have a support structure instead of having to struggle. Coming from, in many cases, either a broken home or a home where you struggle with poverty and crime and violence in your neighborhood and even in your home. Those sort of structural issues, I think, are what's leading to these deadly confrontations between cops and kids. Not just Michael Brown. 8 young black men killed by police when they turned deadly violence towards the police in St. Louis City and St. Louis County since Michael Brown's death.
Patrick Lynn, you're one of the brightest policy minds in the state. People don't say stuff like he just said. Is the approach to fill in some of the gaps in some of these schools?
Exactly. I've been saying this forever. I echo what Jeff says. The most important thing, you see this in the Harlem Project, what they've done with schools. You need to take those kids, for them to be what they've been successful there, is they've taken the kids for 24 hours, 7 days a week. A lot of the kids move there and live there and where they're schooled, or they're there from, say, 6 a.m. to 10 p.m., and they're just going home to sleep. Because a lot of the educational problems are the struggles they have at home with poverty and violence and drug abuse, and that the only way to really save these kids is to get them in a learning environment and a safe environment for as many hours of the day as possible.
Caleb Rowden, you think outside the box. Is there a way to fund what was just described?
Well, I think everybody on both sides of an education discussion agree that a large part of the underlying issue is parental involvement and those sorts of poverty-related, crime, violence-related. What we have to understand, though, and the question that we have to ask is, what is the government's job in all of this?
Fair question.
You know, are we going to always default to a big government, more money into the public sector solution, or are we going to be honest with ourselves about what's the government supposed to do and what's the government not supposed to do? And I'm certainly not saying that, you know, that we shouldn't do anything at all, but I don't necessarily prescribe to the idea, well, let's just put all the money into the public sector and let the public sector be parents and do the job of parents, because at the end of the day, I'm not sure that works either.
Kevin, Representative Corlew, would your colleagues try some of those experimental things? Is it something you think could pass? And there's also a cost of doing nothing, right?
There is a cost of doing nothing in which we're still failing students and their families. I think that we do need to think outside the box in terms of education issues. You know, and some of the aspects of even the current bill is trying to do that, to look at, you know, within a district, to be able to give some choice within a district so that a student wouldn't necessarily have to go to another school district, but to another school building. Giving some parents the tools that they need to make sure that their students, their kids can be educated properly, and to avoid some of those societal impacts that we see.
All right, quick hits. I do want to follow up with you, Representative Roorda. What the effect of SB 5 and cutting back on the tickets? Give me the cops' view on that.
Fraternal Order Police has been supportive of Senator Schmidt's bill from day one. Our lobbyists testified in favor of it. Our state president testified in favor of it, I believe. We don't like rogue police departments any more than the next person. We think it gives the good professional cops that I represent every day a bad name, and we go so far as to support the idea of accrediting police departments and eliminating the rogue police departments at that level.
Representative Rowden, where you and I live, we can have a 20% of some kangaroo city's budget. In St. Louis County, it's 12. Is that something that could be fixed?
Well, I mean, I think it's something to look at, but I think we also have to realize that when St. Louis County has 11% of the population, has 34% of the outstanding warrants, and has the tickets, there are municipalities that have 10, 20, 30 times as many outstanding warrants as they do population. St. Louis County probably needs to be treated differently at this point. And so whether or not the numbers were right, you know, is probably another conversation, but I certainly believe that the way in which St. Louis County has made their bed here, now it's time to lay in it, and it's time to get serious and reform it.
Patrick Lynn, last question. Does right to work pass? Do they blow the Senate up? Does it get PQ'd? Does the governor have to veto it? Is it a hot summer in Missouri?
My worry is it's going to be a hot summer in Missouri.
Excellent. Well, we'll have to leave it there. And lastly, on this Mother's Day edition, I want to give a very special shout out to a very special mother. I know we all have those all over the panel, but I'll do one. Terry Fawn in West Butler County. Wish you happy Mother's Day. And to all the mothers out there, we'll see you next week on This Week in Missouri Politics.